the ghost orchid is truly iconic when it comes to Florida species. I mean, there have been books, movies, blogs, all kinds of media generated just by this incredibly mysterious and beautiful flower. And the reason that we're really interested and concerned in it is because it's at risk of extinction, like millions of other species that are at risk during this extinction crisis that we're seeing. We're particularly concerned about the ghost orchid because of impacts from poaching and climate change. And in particular, that includes storms of increasing intensity and sea level rise. We also know that development is continuing to encroach on really important habitat for this species and many others. And so we're seeking the protections of the Endangered Species Act to help give this flower a fighting chance while we deal with these truly global issues that are affecting species across the planet.
Right. In the U.S. and Fish and Wildlife Service, they missed the mandatory deadline to make a decision on protecting the flower. So what factors do you think contributed to that delay?
Well, unfortunately, we're seeing these delays across the board for species that need protections. And that may be for a number of factors, but certainly we're seeing that more and more species are becoming endangered and that they're needing these protections. And the agency often says that they're unable to keep up. But the fact is that the Endangered Species Act requires the agency to make decisions of whether or not to list a species within a year after they determine that it might warrant protections. And that's exactly what happened here. The ghost orchid was found that it might warrant protections, and it was supposed to get a decision within a year of having filed the petition. Unfortunately, that's not what the agency has done. And that leaves this species in legal limbo without any protections at all, even though we know deep in our hearts and based on the best available science that it needs it now.
All right. So moving on to the fight for these protections, could you just tell me a little bit about how that got started and what your plans are and what your goals are?
Well, as with many species, when we start a fight for protections, it's because the science says that those protections are necessary. And that's exactly what happened here with the ghost orchid. We have one of our experts, George Gann, at the Institute for Regional Conservation, who had loads of data showing that this species needed protections. We also know that one of the places this orchid is found, the Big Cypress National Preserve, is threatened by proposed oil drilling and expanded off-road vehicle use, and that these things could really exacerbate the harm we've already seen to the species. And so we came together and wrote a petition and sent that to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, asking the agency to give this flower protection. And so that really kicked off this whole process. The agency then found that those protections might be warranted. And now here we are still awaiting a final decision and protections for this incredibly imperiled flower.
Wow. And so if they don't take any action about this, what are some of the consequences that might come about from that?
Well, on the legal side, we can file a lawsuit and ask a court to order the agency to put those protections in place. On the ground for the flower, it means it continues to be imperiled. We know that just last year, poachers were caught trying to take ghost orchids from a state preserve. And we know that that kind of poaching is going to continue. And without protections, we don't have strong deterrents, at least strong enough, right? Because the current deterrents aren't doing enough to stop those poachers. We also know that this flower is going to need our help as it overcomes changes from climate change, increased intense hurricanes, and sea level rise. And it's not going to get any of that help until those protections are in place. So it's really critical. And we've sent this notice to say this needs to happen and it needs to happen soon. And if we don't get those protections, we're going to do everything we can to save the ghost orchid.
And finally, what could listeners do to possibly help in these efforts?
Well, I think that they can write to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and express their support for protections. I think that they can also help by informing their communities, friends, family, that it's best to keep plants in the wild where they belong, certainly incredibly rare ones like the ghost orchid. And I think just doing everything you can to stand up for the last few wild places we have in the state. We know they're disappearing incredibly fast to development and will continue to disappear as sea level rise begins to swallow our coasts. And so everything we can do to protect our wild places is going to make all of our species more resilient.